Welcome to painting class. Today our first exercise that we're going to do is what we call a value scale. And we're going to work in watercolor and learn how to create a range of light to dark within watercolors through creating washes. Okay, so the first thing you'll need is the little paper that's around 4 inches by 8 inches. So if you measure it, it's going to be 4 inches tall and about 8 inches wide. Okay, so we're going to make a 1 by 1 inch grid on here, and here's how you do it. Starting with your ruler at the top left corner, we're going to make a mark at every inch. So the inch mark is the longest line next to the number. So I'm going to go, and that last one should be right around the 8 inches, right around there. And I'm going on the top, and I'm going to go on the bottom and measure out a grid. So every 1 inches. All right, and then what I'm going to do is connect these marks. And you can draw lightly. You don't have to press super hard with your pencil. And this paper will erase, so if you mess up, just get that good eraser out and erase it. All right, now we're going to do horizontal lines. So I'm going to line my ruler up vertically this time and make a mark at every 1 inch over here. So it should be right around there. One, 2, and 3, and connect them. And just make sure when you're using your ruler to press down with it and then draw. That way it doesn't slip on you. Let's see, let's get those lines matched up good. And right around there. Okay, this is close over here. You may have a side that's off just a little bit, but that's okay. We want to have 8 sections across and 4 down. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to find our white board that you have with your number on it. I don't have a board, so right now I'm just going to tape directly onto the table. So I'm going to take my table, or my tape, my painter's tape here. I'm going to take and tear off a piece that's a little bit wider than the actual piece, and I'm just going to overlap it, not all the way with the width, just about 1/4 inch on the top, and I'm going to press it down. That way the water doesn't get around it. And I'm going to go, or underneath it, and I'm going to go all the way around my paper. Let's see. Press it down. And the cool thing about painter's tape is it'll come up real easy and it shouldn't tear your paper, so that's a good thing. When you're working with watercolors, I always suggest to tape down the corners like this because it keeps your paper down, because the paper likes to buckle when you add a lot of water to it. And also when you peel it up, it makes a pretty nice frame around the picture. So that's what you want to do to start with to prep your surface up. Now, you have your watercolors here, and you can pick any order that you want your colors to go in for these. So, but I'm just gonna go lightest, like warm over here, cool over here. And I'm just gonna lightly label what colors I want. So I'm gonna do yellow, orange, red, violet, blue, green, brown, and black. And I'm just lightly labeling it up there at the top, okay? Now, the next things you need, and I'm gonna set this to the side. It's over here. So I'm gonna set it over on the side here. I'm gonna get my watercolor brushes out. And I have a cup of water and a paper towel. Okay, so make sure you have that. And I'm gonna get out a brush that's not too big for the square and not too small for the square. We don't want a little bitty tiny brush. So let's look and see some of our options. So would this work for ours? Surely could. Let's see if there's one that would fit just a little bit better. I think this one would work. And it looks like it's a number 8. And if you look, they'll have different sizes, like a 5/8, a 2, and so on. And you want to take good care of those brushes. And I want to talk to you guys first off before we start and on the first day about proper brush handling and storage so that it doesn't ruin your brushes, okay? So, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get my palette out. Okay, and then what I'm going to do first is work on mixing up a light value, and I'm just going to paint rows of light values at a time. You may want to skip rows because if you put a wet color next to a wet color, it's going to bleed together. So here's what I'm going to do to start my lightest value. I'm going to take a little bit of water in my brush, and I'm going to put 2, 3, 4, 5 drops in the palette. I'm going to dry my brush off a little bit. I'm going to come over here to my yellow. Let's see where we got it. I'm going to swirl it in there and pick up the color with the brush. I'm going to go back in and mix up a light value here. It's going to be when you add water, it lightens the color. All right, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the paint and I'm going to pull and push and use both sides of my brush to make a light value. And if I have too much water on my brush, I can always blot the extra off with a paper towel. So what I'm going to do is kind of do a time lapse of how to get your first values in, and then I'll go through and explain how to do the second value. Okay, now we have our first row of our first columns of the lightest values of each color applied. It should take about 5-10 minutes for it to really dry. You can kind of tap your finger on it to see if it's still wet. Like there's some areas here that are still pretty wet, so I'm going to let that dry just a little bit more while I'm talking. So we've got the lightest values that we can with the watercolor, and we learned that watercolor gets lighter by adding more water to it. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to save my colors, okay, because I'm going to keep these because I've got some nice colors worked up. And what I'm going to do is add more colors and just add another layer to each of the second row now. So I'm going to time lapse that and let you guys see what that looks like. Okay, now that you can see we've got our second row done, and you kind of saw in the time lapse where I got to here and realized that we need to cover everything again with a second coat down to this second row, okay? And you'll notice that there's some little inconsistencies with the straightness of my lines and a little bit there, but I'll show you guys how to go and clean that up. So we're going to move on next to adding value to our third row. And what we're going to do is leave these 2 rows alone because they've got a nice transition here. And I'm going to go and paint over the next 2 sections. So basically what we're doing is going in and just filling in more and more color to get the color brighter and more intense. Okay, so we've got one more row to do, and then we're going to clean up. And remember to let your rows and your areas dry before you start moving on to the next one. So sometimes you get a little bit of this bleed over, and that's okay, we can fix that, but your colors will look nice and crisp and neat when you let each section dry in between each one. Now, you may start to be running out of colors, so like I'm out of blue, green, a little bit of yellow and orange. So what I'm gonna do is just, grab a little bit of water in my brush, not much, just a little dot. And then what I'm gonna do is come over here and swirl in some color and make it nice and super, super concentrated over here. So I'm just gonna get a lot of really rich, bold colors in each one of my palettes. For beginning exercises, I like to try to not apply directly from the palette, but to teach you all that you can gradually darken and lighten your colors and create a variety of values with those other than just painting directly from the palette. So we're gonna work on getting these really nice and rich colors in. So we want a super ultra concentrated amount of color on these. Purple's pretty good. Purple's really a strong color anyway. It's got a lot of nice pigment in it. These lighter ones on the prangs need a little bit more help. And just remember, clean your brush off between your colors and dry them off too. All right, so we're gonna get our palette looking like this, okay? And we're gonna let this dry. So next, let's look at how we're gonna go in and finish this last row of bright values, an intense row here. And then I'll show you guys how to clean up all these little rough edges and make it nice and neat and smooth. Okay, now we're gonna go in and work on cleaning up the areas that don't have straighter lines. Maybe the colors don't touch. Maybe there needs to be a little bit of extra color added. So we're gonna do that once this all dries. And then I'll show you some tips and tricks for cleaning up. Another thing is you'll see me, when I go to clean up, I'm gonna use a littler brush. So I'm gonna take like let's find a good size brush. I'm gonna take like a 3, and then what I'm gonna do is dip it in some water, and then I'm just gonna go and even these edges out. And if there's areas that are too dark, like right here, I'm gonna clean my brush off, dip it in some water, and then dab it with some paper towels to get that color off. I might need to spread the color and make it more even. So just take a look at some cleanup tips and tricks, and then I'll show you guys how to take the tape off once it's finished. So I'm finishing up with my project, and what I did was I went back in and added a darker value over the areas that I thought it needed to be darker. I went back with just a wet brush that's real damp, and I dried it off, and I smoothed in and evened out all the colors. And then what I did is I took pencil and I outlined all my shapes. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to peel off the tape. You can save the tape or reuse it because it's a pretty good tape. And then I'm going to take that off. I'm going to let it dry after this. And then what I'm going to do is take a picture of it and photograph it and upload it to Seesaw underneath value scales in watercolor. Also, if you would like, you can flip it on the back and put your name and then the date on there. Today's the 2nd, 2020. And then there you go. If you run into troubles like having a little bit of this peeling, it's just where we've added a lot of water and went back and smoothed it. This is just a practice paper, so it doesn't absorb as much as your good finished pieces will. But, you know, I wanted you guys to get a good idea of how to apply washes of color, which is basically just laying down a flat area of color and going back in and creating lighter and darker values, how to clean up areas and refine your paintings. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson and learn how to fix your mistakes.